I get started, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Stephanie Frederick. I'm a school psychologist out in Glen Ellen, which is about 40 minutes west of Chicago. So I'm there, working there in 3 elementary buildings, so I'm out there all the time. And I actually did my graduate studies at Northern Illinois University, and I just finished up my dissertation last year, which was on myth, bullying, and suicide, so that's why I was kind of asked to come here and present on this topic. I have a little bit to tell you about my research. I could go on and on and on about it, so hopefully I'll try to keep it engaging, but I've got all this other stuff to talk to you about, so I'm trying to think of what else. I live in Wheaton, and I live out there with my husband and my dog, and yeah, that's kind of about it. I know that I kind of want to know a little bit about you so that I can kind of know who I'm talking to for my presentation. I know there's a lot of graduate students, so could you just raise your hand if you're a grad student? What program are you guys from? Are you like a school psych program or school psychologist mostly? How about undergrad students? Are there undergrad students there? So that's a lot. So what program is it? Like, are you guys psych majors? Education. Oh wow, awesome. Okay. What's that?
We need to attend at least one conference.
Oh, you do? So are you guys, are you seniors? Are you junior? Awesome. So and then are you guys doing student teaching right now, or is that not yet?
Next semester.
That's next semester.
We're student teaching at ISU.
We're
You guys
PDSing.
Yeah, we're PDF students,
Oh, okay.
professional development school teachers.
Okay, gotcha. So you guys are student teaching?
Yes.
For all year.
All year. Now, are you guys in practicum or anything like that?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Oh, that's awesome that I have got teachers in
They
here.
actually have to do how many hours of professional development?
So we need a 3-hour
3-hour
conference.
conference, like 2 meetings, 5-hour volunteers.
Oh,
So
wow.
they get, so like professionals get like CPDH or CPDU, so they have their own version of the certificate. It's very
Oh,
official.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. I'm so glad you guys are here today. Is anyone here that works, I thought you wanted to say something. Is anyone here that works full-time in a school as either a teacher? Awesome. Is anyone a teacher? What about like support staff, like school psychologist, social worker, counselor? Yes. Awesome. Okay. Are you guys elementary, middle, or high school?
Middle.
High school.
Middle high school.
Middle and high school. Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, I'm so glad I have kind of a lot of people here today. So I'm going to go ahead and so I just have a brief overview. I did update. I know you guys have handouts in the folder. As I've kind of gone through my information, I have kind of updated it, added things. I took out a couple things. So if you guys are looking at the handouts, it is a little bit different from what is in there. So I apologize for that. I wanted to do, I'm hoping you guys will humor me. I was at a conference over the summer, and as part of the conference, what we did is we took a pre-assessment before the conference and then this post-assessment at the end of the conference. And I thought that it was so helpful because I feel like when you go to these day-long conferences, I try to always take like one piece of information from each session just to kind of try and remember. I just try to take one thing away because you learn so much stuff. But this kind of this helped me when I did this over the summer. It helped me just kind of organize the information that was going to be in the session, and then it allowed me to look at the end, like how much I learned over that session. So this is, I literally thought of this when I was falling asleep last night, so I added it this morning. So it's not in your handout, but I'm wondering if you guys can take a moment, and I know you guys don't have tables or anything like that, but just take a moment and look at these, and I don't know if you want to write down the numbers, but just try and self-assess where you guys are kind of feeling on some of these topics. Obviously, we're going to go over these today, and then we'll kind of take a look, if we have time, kind of take a look at the end too. So I'll give you guys just like 30 seconds to kind of look at this. Okay, is everyone kind of ready? Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of dive right in. I thought I would kind of start out the presentation just with an overall definition definition of what suicidal behaviors are, and then I'll kind of go into how it's related and not related to bullying and what kind of the role the media plays, since that's a big, huge part of it right now. And then I thought I'd end with just some prevention, intervention strategies, as well as what we're trying to do in my district currently. So typically, research says that suicidal behaviors is this continuum of behaviors that it kind of starts out on one end of the spectrum as this ideation or thoughts, this vague notion of kind of thinking about death and thinking about committing suicide. Kind of the next step is the intent, and what this typically is where students have a method in mind, they have a plan, maybe they write a note or are thinking about writing a note, thinking about what they're going to put in that note. And then kind of on the other end of the continuum is that attempt, and then finally a completed death is at the very end of that continuum. I'm going to talk a little bit about prevalence rates. So it's actually, the CDC just kind of came up with new statistics for this, and they found that suicide rates are actually the second leading cause of death for adolescents and the third leading cause of death for children. So obviously it's kind of very high, very problematic, and because of these rates, you know, we obviously think of it as this public health concern. So this is also a new research study that's newish, kind of came out in 2011, so it's already kind of getting updated. But this is a study from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that was, again, published by the CDC, and that just kind of helps us to look at the prevalence rate across that continuum of behaviors. They used a nationally representative sample across high school students, so there were I believe it was over 2,000 students that were part of this survey. And this survey assessed more than just suicidal behaviors, but this is just specifically focusing on their students. And what I thought was most concerning about this is that 16% of the students indicated on the survey that they had these suicidal ideations within the past year. So when you think about that, if you think about your high school, let's say you have a high school of 1,000 students, that means 160 of those students had actually thought in the past year about committing suicide, which is a ton, a lot of students. It's really problematic. 13% actually had a plan. 8% had actually made an attempt. So again, if you're thinking about that high school, that's 80 students actually had made an attempt. And then 2% actually made an attempt that warranted some sort of a medical attention. Overall, we tend to see that girls engage in higher levels of suicidal ideation than boys, but boys are more likely to die by suicide than girls are. So the reported suicides in this 10 to 24 age group, 81% of them were actually boys. And the suicidal behavior rates in children is much lower, but it is growing. So actually already this year, I've already had to conduct 2 risk assessments, one for a second grader and one for a third grader. Just this year, we've been in school for 6 weeks, one that resulted in a hospitalization. So it's just something that even those that are working in elementary schools, I started my job last year. Like I said, I'm in 3 elementary schools, kind of thinking I wasn't going to really be involved in a lot of this, but I have been. So it's just something to really be aware about, even in those early childhood or early elementary years. So this graph, I apologize, is a little bit outdated. I just like it because I feel like it gives a really good visual representation of the rates of depression. And so actually suicidal ideation and depression are very, very closely related. Apart from previous suicide attempts, depression tends to be one of the highest risk factors for suicidal behaviors. And we find that with depression, starting in mid to late adolescence, depression rises drastically for both boys and girls. But that rise tends to be much greater in girls. So you can see that on the graph. And this graph is, I apologize, it's almost 20 years old, but I can't find the exact numbers. In order to update it, I actually stole it from one of my graduate professors when I was in graduate school. So I would actually say that that rise would actually be a little bit earlier now than what that graph is showing. And then prevalence rates for clinical depression in children tends to be a little bit low. It's typically under 3%. A lot of times, though, it's very, very hard to diagnose depression in children, mostly because it tends to represent itself in different ways. A lot of times in children, that symptoms of depression more look like irritability, and so it's just much less likely to be diagnosed. And so these rates are just that diagnosis of clinical depression. I wanted to talk just a little bit about theory, only because it does tie so nicely into prevention and intervention strategies. And I apologize, I don't want to kind of bore you with this kind of theory kind of stuff, but one of the main theories of suicidal behavior is by Joyner. It's called interpersonal theory of suicide. And really what Joyner and his colleagues talk about is these three main characteristics, and there's a drastic difference between people that have a desire for suicidal behaviors and others that have a capability for suicidal behaviors. One of the main characteristics is called thwarted belongingness. And what this means is that we all kind of have this need or want to belong. Social isolation has been found again and again and again in all the research to be a really high risk factor for students feeling with low self-esteem, depressed, and then again resulting in that suicidal behavior. Another important piece to that is reciprocal care. So if somebody doesn't feel like they have others they can count on or feel supported by others, that likely will result in higher levels of some of this internalizing distress. But it also works the other way. So if somebody, like a student, doesn't feel like they can help others or they can support others, it kind of results in this feeling of uselessness. And that also results in higher levels of distress. The perceived burdensomeness, there's a couple of different aspects of that characteristic. One of the main things that they call it self-hate. That's where the low self-esteem and the shaming kind of comes in. Another big part of people that really engage in higher levels of suicidal behavior is that they don't feel like their life is worth anything. So they actually feel like their death might be worth more. They feel like they're a burden to family and friends, and that other people's lives would be better if they were no longer here. So a lot of that comes in with family conflict. And so that's kind of the family conflict, family support is huge for that characteristic. And that third one is acquired capability. And there's two things that is a part of that characteristic. We tend to have, this ties a little bit into evolutionary theories of like fear and anxiety. And over time, we've evolved to kind of fear suicidal behaviors. And so students that have higher levels of suicidal behavior tend to be a little bit desensitized to some of those characteristics or behaviors. So they might have had more exposure to death and more exposure to violence. They also are more likely to have access to lethal means. So that's kind of the net characteristic. So that's kind of the most, that's kind of the theory that's talked about the most. Bronfenbrenner's ecological model or social ecological model is also another model that we kind of think about both with bullying, that's a really big model with bullying, as it is with suicidal ideation. Has everyone heard of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model? Will you raise your hand if you've kind of heard of it? Yeah, I feel like it's like an education class. I mean, it's kind of everywhere, right? So we hear it all the time, so I don't need to kind of go through that. But I do feel like it. This ties really nicely into, I don't know how many of you were able to go to the keynote speaker today, but it really ties into that overall community where we have different systems working together for prevention and intervention. And then I wanted to talk really quick about social support and connectedness. So with research in children and adolescents, we find that how connected children and adolescents are with their schools tends to be a huge, huge protective factor. So when they feel supported by friends, classmates, teachers, coaches, and other support staff in their school, they're much less likely to report that internalizing distress. And that's kind of come up again and again in that research. This is not, I apologize, this is not in your handout, I don't think. Oops, what did I do? There we go. But I just kind of wanted to note some of the risk protective factors. And it made me think of what the keynote speaker said at lunch today, that really we are always talking about reducing risk factors, when really our focus should be on promoting those protective factors. And really when you look at those two together, it's really, they're just kind of the opposite of one another. So when we think about intervention and prevention, we're really just trying to increase that support, that school connectedness, that skills in problem solving and conflict resolution. That's all of that SEL that I feel like you guys probably have heard all day long today. And then the easy access to mental health services. This is something that we are struggling in my district, is how to help our students be more connected and able to access some of these community resources. So I wanted to also include this in the PowerPoint. They just came out within the last month or so with these warning signs for suicide. And one of the things that I want to make sure that is clear, because I feel like the media, and I'll talk about the media in a couple slides, but one of the things the media appears to do, at least in the stories that I've kind of seen, is that, you know, that suicidal behavior was unexpected, or there was really no warning signs, but really most of the time there is. And so the more that we can kind of promote and learn and educate about these warning signs, the more we can do to kind of to prevent it. But what I tend to look for, obviously working in the school setting, and all of you are all in school settings, what does this look like in school? One of the things that I look at, I think is most important, is attendance. Have you seen maybe higher rates of attendance that weren't there before? So this year the student is not coming to school, maybe refusing to come to school, or maybe they're out sick. Or so that's what the school nurse says, right? Anything that was maybe not typical from what that student's behavior or pattern of attendance was like last year. Also, you want to just look at loss of interest in activities that maybe they previously enjoyed. Maybe they loved to read. Maybe they loved to play outside at recess, but now they no longer want to do that. So as their teacher, that's one of the things that you're going to be the first one to recognize that. Not the counselor, not the social worker, that's going to be the teacher that's going to recognize that. You're going to know your students the best. So that's the other thing that you're going to want to kind of look for. In those older grades, middle school and high school, substance abuse, that's also a huge, huge risk factor, is when students are engaging in substance abuse. Sudden unexplained levels of irritability, especially with younger students. One of the things that we're always looking for in writing samples, or if you're in the younger classes, is seeing negative themes of death maybe in their play. So that can always come out. I will never forget, I worked in a research lab where we scored hundreds and hundreds of writing samples for school districts in the area. And essentially what we were scoring was there was a one-sentence writing prompt. And then the students essentially had 3 minutes to write whatever kind of came to their head based on that writing prompt. And it was, I mean, you can tell a lot from a student. We did not know these students, right? These writing samples came to us. We did not know the district. We did not know the students at all. But you really can know a lot about the students just based on what they are choosing to write about or choosing to play with kind of during that free time. But really, I just think most of all, just be alert to any changes in the child that maybe wasn't there before. That's going to be your main risk factor or warning sign. Okay, so I do want to take time to talk about how the media plays a role in our knowledge of how bullying and suicide are related, as well as just the public in general. So the media is actually the reason why I decided to dive a little bit deeper into this relationship between bullying and suicide. So I started my dissertation in 2012, maybe, because I was just hearing all of these stories about bullying and suicide, and bullying causing suicide, and people were calling bullies murderers, and I wanted to dive more deeper into learning about this relationship. Because if a person only got their knowledge about these two constructs from the media, they would get quite a skewed idea about how they're related. So I feel though, just looking at some of these titles, it appears that we would think, and I think a lot of the general population thinks, that bullying directly causes suicide or suicidal behavior. That there's really nothing else involved with some of these victims except for bullying. And that's simply not the case. That's not what research talks about. A lot of the media, it focuses more on blame and punishment, and it tends to take away attention from other really important risk factors. Some of the things I've already talked about, like substance abuse, depression, those kinds of things. Mental illness, problem solving, things like that. So the media just tends to overstate and oversimplify kind of this relationship with no focus on prevention at all. Some research, I've been trying to dive a little bit more deeper into how the media has a role in this relationship. And some of the research has actually found that there has been increases of reported suicide based on how the media is reporting it. And one of the things that I feel like a lot of people talk about is that suicide contagion and what causes it. And is it a real thing? And essentially what that is when one or more suicides are repeated in a way that maybe contributes to another suicide. And so we're going to talk about how the media should be reporting suicide in order to prevent that. So because of the media, because we just have a huge blast of all of these stories kind of coming to the rise, they came out with recommendations for reporting on suicide. And I apologize, this is really hard to read, but if you just go to, I have the link there at the bottom, reporting on suicide. So you can kind of look to see some of the recommendations that they come out with for the media. A lot of it is really just, we're stating facts, right? This is not a story for entertainment. We just need to state the facts. We need to make sure that we have sources that are reliable. And really what we need to focus on, again, is making sure in these media stories that we're covering how to prevent. We're including in their resources. We're including their media hotlines, who to talk to in the future, rather than focusing on the details of what happened. There was one study in 2010 that looked at a review of how these suicidal behavior stories were covered in the past 2 years, I believe. They found that over half of them reported too many details of the incident. So they reported the method and the location of the suicide, and fewer than 7% of the stories reported on warning signs, risk factors, depression, or resources for treatment. And I know that even just thinking about, I'm sure you've seen all these stories. When you think about these stories, they never, ever include any of those resources for treatment. There has been some concern, just kind of with the age of the internet, right? About even if all of our mass media outlets do abide by these recommendations, is that really kind of the solution to the problem? So an at-risk child can simply Google teen suicide, and they're going to come up with a plethora of stories that glorifies the behavior. One of the things that's really problematic is what research is starting to show is actually Twitter, because what happens is that these stories kind of catch on, and then they have what's called condolences tweets, and a lot of times they're from celebrities, and a lot of times the celebrities are putting in that child or adolescent's name, and they're really, without meaning to, right? We don't mean to do this, but they're really kind of glorifying the situation. So instead of tweeting about, once again, resources, they're kind of tweeting about the details and about that child or adolescent. For somebody that's at risk, for somebody that's already thinking about some of these behaviors, and then they see all of these tweets, they see that Taylor Swift knows that person's name now, it's just not something that we need to be reporting. We really need to focus, again, on prevention when we're talking about these in that media outlets. So I've already talked about that, yes, absolutely, because of all of these behaviors, because of how bullying and suicide has been reported, it's absolutely this public health concern, and that's why there's all this research now that's on the rise. So there has been, in the past 20 years, a plethora of research, and so what do we know from this research? So we do know that bullying and suicidal behaviors have a common set of risk and protective factors. So those factors that I put in that slide earlier, that's really common for both of these behaviors. We know that when a student engages in bullying behavior, when a student is a victim, they are more likely to engage in suicidal behaviors. But that this relationship is very complex. So what we don't know is if bullying directly causes suicide. So, and actually a lot of the studies that have come out, we found that there's actually other things that are more closely related to suicidal behaviors than bullying. So for example, in a lot of these studies, if we control for depression or we control for exposure to violence, a lot of times bullying is no longer related to suicidal behaviors. So what we're finding is that bullying tends to exasperate the issue rather than just directly cause it as that sole factor. There's also been a ton of studies about, is this relationship between bullying and suicide more strong for girls than it is for boys, or victims versus bullies, and really we're not quite sure. So there is a lot of research out there that says that bullying might be more damaging or for girls than it is for boys, meaning that girls tend to report higher levels of distress as a result of bullying than boys. But we're not quite sure how that relationship is with suicidal behaviors yet. We're also looking at is if a student is a victim of bullying, is that more closely related to suicidal behaviors than a student who engages in bullying? And really what the research is leaning towards there is that if a student engages in both, right? So if they're a bully as well as a victim, they're more likely to report suicidal behaviors than if they're either a victim or a bully. But again, we don't have enough repeated studies to really know that for sure yet. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what I did for my dissertation, because I actually was lucky enough to conduct a school-wide suicide screening for high school students in Northern Illinois. And when I went and proposed my dissertation idea to my committee, they kind of all thought I was crazy, right? Because I wanted to actually go into a school, hand out suicidal ideation surveys to all the students in the school as part of my data collection. And that is just something that in this day and age, schools are extremely resistant against. So there was kind of two myths that I felt like I had to debunk when I was trying to collect my data for my dissertation. One of the myths that I had to really kind of work around was that students that fill out surveys that are related to suicidal behavior, so questions that are asking students like, how often in the past year have you thought about death? Have you ever written a will? Those kinds of things. A lot of people tend to think that just answering those questions tends to be related to higher levels of stress. So because we're asking about suicide, that means they're going to be thinking more about it. And that's just simply not the case. So there's research out there that shows that students that actually complete these surveys are no more likely to be distressed than if they're completing surveys on really any other topic. Gold and colleague actually looked specifically at this, and they also used a huge sample. And what they did is they had an experimental group of about 1,000 students, and this is high school, and these students completed a survey on suicidal behaviors. The control group actually completed a survey not related to suicidal behaviors at all. What they did is they then assessed their levels of distress before and after the survey, and then they assessed it again 2 days later. And they found that their levels of distress did not differ at all across the two groups. Then they looked at the high-risk group. So they looked at those students that had a lot of those risk factors that we talked about, because they wanted to see, okay, well, what if we give this survey of suicidal behaviors to a particularly at-risk group? Are they going to feel more distressed and more likely to engage in suicidal behavior as a result of this survey? And they actually found the opposite. They found that the students that were the most at risk actually reported lower levels of distress after they completed the survey than before they completed the survey. And one of the things that these authors talked about was that they might have felt that these students who were very at risk might have felt while they were completing the survey that maybe somebody cared, that they knew that they were going to be talking to somebody as a result of the survey. There was a psychiatrist on staff, a social worker, all part of this research that they were doing, and so they might have just felt a little bit more supported as a result of that survey. So really the opposite is true when we think about doing these school-wide suicide screening preventions. The other myth that I had to really debunk was the fact that there just really was there was not enough resources. So what if we identify all these students that are at risk for suicidal behaviors, but we don't know what to do with them? And the thing that I had to really talk with schools about for that is that these students are at risk, right? So the surveys don't make them at risk. So we already have all of these students that are at risk, and let us help you kind of identify resources and things like that. So, and that's exactly what we did. So I finally found a brave school that would let me collect all of this data, and we worked really, really closely with their school counselor and the school social worker in kind of making this happen. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what that looked like. So the school was, it was a ninth grade campus, about 502 students, and we gave surveys that included questions on bullying, both face-to-face as well as cyberbullying. And then we looked at social support, and then I gave a measure of depression, and I also gave a measure of suicidal ideation. It was administered in a group setting, so it was all done in the students' PE classes. And all the students were aware that if they noted on the survey that if they were going to hurt themselves, and they were going to be pulled by one of the NIU staff in order to do a risk assessment for more questioning. So they were all aware of that kind of before the survey began. And so what we did is, based on the results of the survey, as students were handed in, I had a whole team of graduate students, 2 professors as well as myself. As students handed in the survey, we quickly looked for critical items on that suicidal behavior survey and kind of determined their level of risk. So they actually endorsed 2 or more of those critical items. We knew we were going to pull them. So we pulled those students and did a one-on-one risk assessment the following period. So we pulled them right away and did a one-on-one questionnaire with them. The other thing I just wanted to note is, I'll talk a little bit about that risk assessment, but we did give, I tried to copy and paste it here. This was kind of, we had a half sheet of paper for all students, no matter what they endorsed in the survey. But we had that half sheet of paper there available for anyone that wanted to take it. And then, so not every student had to take it, we just kind of had it available, but then we did give it to all the students that we did risk assessments for. So this was the questionnaire that we used for the risk assessment, and before we did the data collection, I trained all of the graduate students and really how to assess for suicide. And one of the main things is that when you're, you know a student is at risk and they might have told you how they're feeling, or it came up on the survey, one of the main things about this risk assessment is that you want to do it in a supportive, caring manner. So one of the things that I really tried to emphasize in my training with the graduate students was that we can't just read the questions off the piece of paper, right? It has to be more in this conversational. So for example, in number 2, you know, does the student have a specific plan? We really just can't say, do you have a specific plan, you know, behind a clipboard, you know, in the office. We kind of just need to talk about you know, what their plan looks like, and it just needs to come out in this more conversational manner. Based on how the students responded to these questions, we then looked at and decided whether they were low risk, moderate risk, or high risk. And all of these questions are related to specific risk factors for suicidal behaviors. None of the students that we interviewed were considered high risk. So most of the students that we interviewed were either low risk or moderate risk. We had a total of 16 students. So there were 403 students that actually completed the survey. Out of those 403 students, we had 16 students, which is 4% of the population, of that high school population, that participated in a risk assessment survey. Of those students, 6 were considered moderate risk, and 6 were considered low risk. And there was actually 3 that we polled that were considered no risk because they were those students that just answered the questions randomly and weren't looking at what they were circling. So for all the students that participated in a risk assessment, we called parents before those students went home that day, so they were aware of that student. And the other thing with parents in mind is we didn't actually get parent consent for passing out these surveys. Which means that we did not have parents sign that they were okay with students taking the survey. Because it was a school-wide effort, what we did is we sent the principal of the school, sent just a note home to all parents letting them know that the survey was going to take place and that they can opt out if they did not want their child to participate. And we only had a handful of parents that actually wrote back and said that they didn't want their child to participate. That was the other thing that the principal was really nervous about, was that, I mean, they weren't sure how parents were going to react to this, but really the parents, overall, the community as a whole, seemed really okay with us kind of giving this survey. The other thing I just kind of want to note, especially for those working as support staff in schools, and this was something that was new to me when I began as a school psychologist, just last year, was that how important it is to have something, a guideline for when you're doing risk assessments. What I was a little bit surprised about when I started, both in my practicum settings as well as where I'm at now, is that districts really quite vary on this. So some districts have their policy and they have specific forms for suicide risk assessments, and then other districts really haven't dived into this at all. And so if that's the case, it's so important to have a guideline in this so that when it comes up, you're prepared. I will never forget in one of my practicum settings, and I was helping the social worker and I was kind of seeing students, and this came up during one of my sessions, and I didn't have I was just so lost as to what to do next. And I had to pull in the counselor and pull in all these people, which is good. It's good to have kind of more people involved. However, it's just so nice to have a guideline and be prepared so that when it does come up, you are prepared. Because when something like this happens, you can't go and create something like this really quick. You kind of have to do it as you go. And then for the teachers here, just kind of knowing the risk factors, and if a student says something, knowing to take it to a support staff at your school immediately. Of the support staff that are here, do you guys have district-wide like procedures for suicide risk assessment, or is it something that you kind of had to create on your own? You had to create it? Yeah.
I do the initial assessment, going through very similar questions. You
Yeah.
know, do you have a plan? Do you have access? Do you know, all of that kind of thing. And if I determine that there's a risk there, then I can call the county mental health. We have, I think actually it originates over here at SAS.
Yes. Yes. I'm very
And
familiar
then
with
they'll send
that.
some,
Yes.
we call them, and then they send somebody from the county mental health over to do a more formal assessment.
Okay. So, but you kind of created your own form. and
Well,
you're-
basically going by the same thing.
By the
everybody
same
else
thing.
says. Yeah.
Right, yeah. That was one of the things with my district when I started, is that there really wasn't, across the district, there was no sort of uniform way to kind of handle it. So we, as the psychologists and the social workers in the building, since last year, we've kind of had these ongoing meetings about how we can handle risk assessments, both in terms of when students threat others and as well as when students threat themselves. And it's still kind of this ongoing discussion about whether it should be, we'll handle it on our own or as a building-wide thing. One of the practices that we have in place actually is we're really not allowed to do these risk assessments alone. So if a student initially tells us something that is concerning, we can go ahead and listen to their conversation and kind of complete this, but then we need to pull in either a social worker or a school nurse or the school psychologist, pull them in so that there's a witness. And that's one new procedure that we kind of put in place because of some legal trouble that we have gotten in, that the district has gotten in the past, when it's just kind of been one person. Okay, so these are I just realized the time. Okay, so I'm going to go really quickly. These are kind of the results of the survey. One of the most concerning things that came out of my data collection were the number of girls that reported elevated levels of depression. So on the graph on the left, so 85 girls, which was 21% of the students that took the survey, actually endorsed levels of depression at the 85th percentile above on that measure. And then compared to boys, which were 43 boys, which was 11%. And then when you look at the number of students that endorsed higher levels, this is looking at their total score, higher levels of suicidal ideation, 19 girls versus 2 boys endorsed higher levels of suicidal behaviors. But that is really consistent with the research that looks at girls are really reporting higher levels of ideation than boys are. One of the things that I found when I kind of looked at and analyzed my data, one of the pieces that I found with regards to gender differences was that actually for both face-to-face bullying as well as cyberbullying, I tried to look at those separately. That relationship to suicidal ideation was stronger for girls than it was for boys. And that relationship has been found in research, however, it's kind of still being replicated and things like that. The other thing that I found was when I looked at depression, if I looked at bullying and suicidal ideation, I found that yes, bullying was absolutely significantly positively related to suicidal ideation. However, when I included depression in that relationship, there was no longer a direct relationship between bullying and suicidal ideation. So I think that just goes to show how much depression has in this relationship between bullying and suicidal behavior. The other thing that I found, which was really disappointing, when I looked at social support, a lot of times you'll find that social support will actually buffer this relationship between bullying and this kind of internalizing distress, which means that in general, research has found that students who are bullied, but then also report higher levels of support, tend to report lower levels of distress. And I did not find that at all in my study, which was really super disappointing and kind of shattered my dreams. But I found that really the role of support did not help a lot of my students that were reporting being bullied. And one of the things that it made me think about as a result of my study was really how we're doing this prevention and intervention. And I apologize, I only have like 5 minutes left to kind of go over this. But it made me think of how important it is to prevent bullying, kind of in those early and elementary and early childhood, so that we're not trying to pick up the pieces later. I am going to skip this. So one of the things that we're doing at my school is, I'm just going to echo from our keynote speaker from just before lunches. We're really trying to focus on the social emotional learning. And at my district, I'm part of the, what we call the social emotional learning committee. And what we're doing, and we're in the very, very beginning stages, is pretty much exactly what Ms. Schlinger, I think her name is that right? Was talking about, was we're trying to embed a lot of these SEL characteristics kind of into the curriculum. So we have a committee that's comprised of all different staff members throughout the district. So it's all support staff, which includes psych, social workers, counselors. We also have representative teachers from each grade level, PE teachers, as well as administration that are all a part of this committee. And what we're working on right now is how we're embedding this into the core curriculum. What teachers don't realize is that they're really already doing a lot of these SEL competencies without even realizing it. A lot of it, as we learned about over lunch, is coming out in English and literature and reading, and when they're reading stories. They're already talking about how characters are feeling. And so what we're trying to work with teachers on is how to do it a little bit more intentionally, right? So they're already doing it, but how can we do it just a little bit more? And how can we assess it? So that's one of the things that we're working on now. Something that we always try to tell teachers, because I feel like with teachers, it's you have so much on your plate. You're trying to include all of this instruction across multiple areas. Now we've got new writing curriculum, we have new science standards, all of these things that we don't have enough time in the day. So how are we going to include SEL in our day when we've already got all of these other things? And what we try to tell teachers is that this is not something that has to be added to your plate, it is the plate. So what we do is, in your science curriculum, in your social studies curriculum, let's look at your lessons. Let's see where we can embed. Let's see where you're already doing it, and let's see where we can embed more. The district over the years has kind of done that model where social workers are pushing in for 30 minutes a week, and we're just finding that it's not beneficial. Students are not generalizing really a lot of those skills across their day or over years. So what we're really trying to do is this co-teaching model where social workers are trying to do more than just 30 minutes and be done. They're trying to be involved in morning meetings in the afternoon, and then they're trying to go in during English or literature and reading, as opposed to just doing a separate lesson. We're still working on this whole evidence-based program. My administration currently is a little bit kind of turned off with these kind of tailored programs, just because in the past it's been do it for 30 minutes and then you're done. So what we're trying to do now is include SEL as part of this Tier 1 school-wide, and then as we are finding that students are struggling, so a lot of those students that are at risk, then let's look at those. Let's look at what programs we can use for those students that need more than just that SEL that's embedded into their instruction. One of the reasons why I'm talking about this is because just as Mr. Slinger was talking about it, for bullying prevention programs, that same research, that same, it's inconsistent, the effect sizes are small. It's the same for those suicidal ideation programs that are kind of packaged, right? So that's why, as a district, we are also trying to do this SEL, because we have found that it really does benefit the kids in terms of really trying to promote those protective factors. So that's kind of been our focus. I just included this really quick. This is something that we're doing as part of our committee, is we're breaking down all of the different SEL characteristics, and then breaking them down into I can statements, because all of our teachers are really familiar with that terminology, and then what they're doing in terms of how to assess it, and the resources they're using. So that's kind of where we're at right now, is just breaking it down. I am, I added this, so it's not part of your handout, but I have my, oh yeah, we don't have time for that post assessment, sorry. So I have all of my contact information it should be on your handout. Is it on your handout? Okay. I'm more than happy to send you my PowerPoint. You can email me. I'm more than happy to send it to you, so you have some of that extra stuff that I added. But yeah, so I just kind of whizzed through the end there really quick. I'm really sorry. I know I hate it when the presenter kind of talks about all these problems we have, and then they spend 5 minutes on intervention. But does anyone, I know we're kind of running out of time, but does anyone have any questions for me at all about any of these topics? Or I'm also free by email. I'm more than happy to talk to you by email too. So, any questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming, everyone.